Today we're going to work on painting a sunflower. So I have gathered 3 reference images from the internet, and you can see them there on the side of the screen. We have a sunflower with some red or orange petals, a true yellow sunflower with a bit of a lime green center, and then an up-close center on that bottom sunflower that has a little bit more brown and black in it. So my sunflower is going to be kind of an imaginary combination of those 3, and we're going to work on a concept called underpainting. And underpainting is the first layer of your painting and very often focuses on building form and adding shadows. We will work with purples and browns to add the shadow colors under the yellow, because purple is the complementary color of yellow, and brown is a natural sort of shadow color for an organic object like a sunflower. So I'm going to be working with a variety of brushes. I have 2 or 3 round brushes and 2 flat brushes. I'm going to start with a basic sketch of a sunflower, so I also will need my pencil. I'll be using my Yarka Semi-Moist 10-pan watercolor palette, and other things that you'll need: a cup of water, maybe 2 for rinsing your brushes, as well as a couple of facial tissues to help you blot and control your paint. So to start, we're going to work with a basic circle-ish shape, and it doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't even have to be a solid line. Here I am kind of working with a bit of a dotted design, and it's a little bit harder for you to see, so maybe I will redraw that a little darker. There we go, that's coming up a little bit better. Now, sunflowers have tons and tons of petals that overlap with one another. So we're going to focus on, let me adjust my camera here so you can see a little bit. Okay, that's a little better. So as I was saying, the sunflowers have lots and lots of petals that overlap with each other. And so I'm going to start with a bit of an almond-shaped petal from the top, and then I'm going to bounce to the bottom and do another almond-shaped petal. We'll go over to the sides, and keep in mind they shouldn't all be the same shape. Some of them might have a little more of a pinched peak, some might be a little rounder. And now to fill in the in-betweens, you should think about spacing them out and creating a bit of a different petal every time. So we're going to add another almond-shaped petal here, and then I'm going to stack one directly behind this petal. So we'll see it a little bit, and then I'm going to have another one poke out from right here. It's possible that this one is going to go overlapping like that. And then maybe we'll have one show here. And in some of the gaps, you can also add extra petals as you go. Now we'll focus on creating the shadow color for our underpainting. Using my round brush, I'm going to wake up my purple and my brown. So it's about 2/3 purple to 1/3 brown. And we'll give it a little swatch here. Check it with a soft edge, see how our shadow looks in extension. And we'll let that dry. Okay, a couple of tests, let those dry, and then we'll see how they look under the yellow. Now, it's important to maintain your whites, and in my little test petal here, I ended up with some shadows towards the edge that I don't really want. So I'm going to try and go in with a clean brush and some clean water, scrub at the surface just a little bit, see if I can activate that paint, And then with a clean tissue and a blot, sometimes you can lift out or at least soften some of those unwanted edges. Okay. I've got my round brush charged up with yellow and my paper is dry. So controlling my edge, I'm going to paint this yellow right on top of the shadow, and being very careful not to scrub too much, not to go back and forth, or you might end up lifting that shadow underpainting. We just want to apply the yellow right over top. And this is called a glaze. So we just let the yellow sit right there on the surface. And all of a sudden this petal feels like it has way more form than if we were just to have painted it with yellow by itself without the underpainting. I'm going to use my flat brush here, just damp but not wet. You can also do this with a round brush if that's all you have. And I'm going to carve into this wet yellow and just lift out some highlights, because I do want to show that there's some bright ridges to this petal as well as those shadows. And so by lifting out some of that yellow, we can see brighter spots. To finish off our test here, I've got my dark shadow, my mid shadow, and my light edge. And just as a reference, I'm going to go with a yellow glaze right over top of this, so I can kind of see how it reacts. Ooh, and look at this. This dark shadow ended up really rehydrating. So I need to be careful not to put the shadows down too thickly, or we might end up with that bleeding and that running in the surface of our petal, and then instead of a yellow sunflower, we will end up with a brown sunflower. So it's good to do some tests. So to apply the shadow colors to our sunflower, I'm going to use a smaller round brush and my flat brush. It is clean. You can see it's maybe stained a little bit on the bristles, but it's clean, colorless water. And I'm going to work that surface with that water to be wet to start with. So we're going to do a little bit of a wet and wet for the petals that are on top. I want those shadows to be a little softer, a little less established than the shadows on the underneath petals would be. So I controlled my water, kept it just within the bounds of my petal, and then with the paint on my fine brush here, I'm going to introduce it just along the edge. Just a little bloom, and then we use our flat brush to coax it and carry it up. I don't want it on the tip, so I'm going to kind of erase that and control the center there. Carve out some lines perhaps, and introduce a bit of a fold. Petals ruffle and roll and unfurl as they bloom, so they end up with these veins and these folds, and that's what makes them feel much more real. Got a little over the edge there, so just blot that. And I'm going to call that shadow done for that petal. It's best to work a couple petals apart. You want to make sure that this dries completely before you work on either side. Otherwise you might end up with cross bleeding and shadow color where you don't want it. So instead of working on this one or this one, I'm going to jump ahead to this petal, which is underneath. And so the strategy I'll use for that one is to actually put the shadow color down first. You can see when it's shadow on dry, it ends up a lot more potent, a lot darker. And then you go in with your flat brush or clean colorless round brush, and you scrub at that edge to soften it. And pull and guide it where you want it to go. Picking up extra paint and blotting it off on your tissue. Because this petal is behind, we're going to see a lot more of an intense shadow at the base than we would on the ones that are in front. we don't want hard edges on our shadows, so always working with 2 brushes for softness. That one's kind of on top, so I'm actually going to go in and blot out some of that shadow. I want it to be brighter here, and this is the behind petal, so we'll add in some shadows there after. Take that bloom, drag it up like a vein. Call that petal done. Now this one is dry, so we can go back in and work for this little peak here, and it's the farthest one behind. It's got 2 petals overlapping it, so we're going to see quite a lot of shadow appearing in this little triangle space. So I worked with wet on dry. I didn't wet the paper first, and now I'm just going to kind of coax it to fill in. It won't be a solid shadow. I do want, you know, to still show that it's a yellow petal, but it will be quite an intense shadow compared to the base of the one beside it. Continuing that dark shadow on the other side of the petals, it will still appear dark where it emerges, but it's going to dissipate towards the tip because there's nothing blocking this petal at the end. Went over my pencil line there a little bit. Try to blot that and dry the side petal. Okay, we're gonna add in a couple of vein extensions and then blend those out. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just repeat that all the way around. So now that the purple underpainting has dried completely, we're going to go ahead and add the first layers of color to our sunflower petals. And I'm going to work primarily with a round brush and yellow, as well as our flat, bright brush and clear colorless water. So I've tried to adjust the document camera angle a little bit, so hopefully you guys can see more of the paintbrush, less of the back of my hand. Learning, you know, as we go. So when you are applying the color, you want to make sure that you're staying within the bounds of each petal and treating them as individual forms. If you can do that, then you'll be able to pay attention to the highlights we'll incorporate, and your bloom, your flower, your painting overall will have a more realistic approach. So I'm gonna grab a clean piece of tissue as well, kind of holding everything all together, multitasking, and we're gonna start with this petal on top right here. And remember, in our test we wanted to try and stay away from putting our shadows too thickly, so I really tried to do that, especially in all of our top petals. In some of the bottom ones you'll see it did get quite dark, and I'll be adding yellow in a little bit of a different way for those ones. So starting with the yellow on this petal here, it's a single pass of my brush. I'm not going to scrub back and forth or do anything like that. And then I'm going to go in with the flat brush. And now I have yellow on one side of my brush there, you can see that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that yellow and go back down the other side of the petal. So it's all about trying to just redistribute the paint that you have, and not scrub or disturb the surface of the paper too much. I'd like a little bit more pure yellow on top of our shadow there. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in. Cleaning off my brush, there's no more yellow on it, so I can kind of coax that yellow to bloom out. And at this edge of the petal, I'm gonna go in with a bit of a drier brush and kind of vacuum up some of that pigment. I don't want it to be too rich at the edge. Show a little bit of highlight there. So there's our first pass for that petal. And same rule applies. We're not going to work directly beside it. We're going to move on to another one. So let's do this half behind petal here. I'm going to use my mixing palette to kind of control the concentration of yellow on my brush. I want it to be relatively charged up, but not too pure, or it's going to end up looking chunky and kind of flat. So we have to maintain that balance between paint and water. So again, single stroke all the way down the length of the petal, and then we'll go in at the edge with our flat brush, overlapping and adding water onto our surface so that our paint can flow into that area at the edge, which is going to be brighter because it's the one that's exposed to the sunlight and the surface. Maybe I'll add just a little bit more yellow pigment at the base, and then we'll carry that up through. So really quickly, you don't spend a lot of time dwelling on these petals, and it's a lot of the same motion over and over. So this side of our petal is feeling pretty dry. I'm going to go ahead and apply the yellow glaze. When we are working in a layer like this with a single color overlay, we call this a glaze. Watercolor is transparent, and so we can see the underpainting through it. Okay, now we'll do the rest of the petals. So it's possible that you'd like to add in some reds or oranges, much like the top sunflower in our reference stack there. And if that's the case, I've just made a separate petal here, and it's going to be the same process as your yellow application, your yellow glaze, only this time you're going to want to mix up for yourself reddy, yellowy, orange, whatever hue you like to go on top of your petal there. So this test petal is completely dry. Again, you have to let the layers dry. If you don't, you risk the disturbance of those colors that you've put down beforehand. And the second thing is, when you do add a layer, add a glaze, it has to be done really smoothly with very little friction, very little brush work against the paper and the paint that's already there. So I'm going to, with my flat brush, clean water, I'm going to just give my whole petal a really even surface of wet water so that no area is any wetter than the other. And then we're going to take that red and drop in our red glaze. Really quick sort of flicks with the brush, and you can choose to go in and coax it, make it a little bit fuzzier if you like, or perhaps you want to enhance it as veins, and then you would wait until it dries a little bit and then do one more pass. Whichever, got a little crazy with that one. Whichever direction your brush feels more comfortable, but you don't want to play with it too much, or you're going to end up with mud. Yeah. I think I'm going to leave my sunflower yellow and just go ahead and work on the center, but it's just another step of glazing if you wanted to add red to yours. So for the center, we're going to do kind of a hybrid of the three references that we have, and the first thing I'm going to do is rely on the shadow color that we already mixed up for the underpainting in our petals. And it started to dry throughout my day here as I've been working on this painting, so I'm just going to rehydrate it, kind of bring in some of these extra little puddles that were all over the place. And so this color is now quite a bit darker, and it might have a little bit of red in it from what was on my brush, but that's okay. That's what I want for my underpainting. And now it might look black on the camera, but it's not a flat black. It's a purpley browny sort of black. You could work with the black from your palette, but it's kind of almost a pollutant. It spreads. So I prefer to mix blacks. Mix them from the purples and the browns, and if you need to get darker, then add a little touch of black into it, but try not to use the black watercolor paint at full strength. It'll flatten your image out right quick. Now the center of your sunflower is growing seeds. This is where the pistils and the stamens are, botanically speaking, where the pollen is generated and passed around and then reincorporated into the seeds that form at the base of all those flower structures. And they are growing in concentric circles. It's a radial design, much like the petals, all sort of symmetrical around a single point, although imperfect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my brush with the underpainting color on it, and I'm just going to really kind of haphazardly stipple for myself one sort of center ring. And now this is going to be the division for me between the area that's going to appear a little bit more yellower, possibly even a little bit of red for the pollen, and then the inside is going to be a little bit more pale brown, and that's where the seeds will have started to be forming. different sizes of stippling for our underpainting here are going to be really effective. So think about the pressure with which you contact the page with your brush. A lighter touch is going to create a tinier little dot, and if you smush it down with more force, you're going to have your bristles spread out and create those larger sorts of blobs of paint. So that last round there was a little bit more of a smush and a bit of a dry brush action going on. The bristles are starting to kind of separate and show some texturization, which is great. But again, this is just our first layer in that center, and it's a form of underpainting. So let that dry. I'm going to use my flat brush to create a bit of a lined pattern in that outside circle. So by charging up my flat brush with our shadow color, it's, you can see, quite narrow and sharp. And what I'm going to do is just kind of touch it down and work it all the way around the center of our sunflower. I want it to go in two different directions, because if you've ever looked at a sunflower up close, the seeds themselves kind of grow in this diamond, spiral, chain link pattern. And the flat brush allows me to really quickly and easily recreate that feeling. Okay, so now we have an underpainting for the outside, and we'll be putting lots of sort of pollen and other textures into that space. Ooh, our center's still a little wet. For the very center of our flower, I'm going to mix up a bit of a lime green. So I've got some green still on my palette, but it's going to be a little muddy, and I really want it to be a true bright green. So I'm just going to clean my palette. So if you scrub at it with the water and then take your tissue, it should wipe clean, whether you're using the lid of your paint or a yogurt lid like I am. It sometimes calls for a restart. So charge my brush up with yellow, create a little yellow puddle. And now I'm going to use a clean brush to find my way, get a little bit of green paint onto my palette, but just a touch, because the yellow is quite sensitive and the green is quite strong. So just a little bit there. Might be too much. We'll only incorporate one of those little blobs to start with. Yeah, I think I can go with that other one in there. Great, so this is a bit of a lime green, quite a yellow green, and that's what I'd like to put into the center of our flower. I'm going to use the clean flat brush with some clean water, and we're going to hydrate the circle. You can see it kind of smearing. It's not ideal. Might have put down that shadow paint a little too thickly. So now I'm going to take our green and I'm going to go wet and wet, and I'm just going to drop it in at different places. I want there to be some white showing through in case we decide to add some yellow here. Okay. And you know what? I'm going to add just the tiniest little pinch of salt. quite like that little texture that the salt has left. Now let's pull our camera back out just a little bit. And we're going to use our oranges and our yellows to put in some of that pollen around the outside. Okay, so we've got an orange and a red, and let's just add that in. Kind of here and there, leaving some spaces, overlapping into our center a little bit is no problem. And then we're going to introduce the orange in a couple of places and continue to work around the center like that. We'll let that dry. I'm not going to use the heat gun because with these wet and wet swirls, I want to allow the paint to flow through the water on its own, and hopefully we'll retain some of those beautiful little blending and mixing swirls. You can see them happening there. So I'm going to let this dry naturally, and I'll be back. So the semi-moist watercolors have that shine on the surface when they're applied thickly, but you can sort of see that the swirl patterns were maintained, so that's great. I think the last thing I'll do to finish off this sunflower, just going to go back in with that shadow color, and oh, that's a little too red. We'll bring in some browns to that outside center. I had left those white spots thinking that I might like to do a wash of green, but I'm thinking brown is going to be a little bit more appropriate for this bloom. I don't want it to be too solid, but just enough to kind of fill in some of those gaps and overlap with our petals at the base, camouflage some of their origins. Go over here. Bring back a little bit more brown into our center. Just some speckles, not all the way. And I think I will blot out some of those first ones I applied so that they're not too solid. Allow some of that white paper to show through here and there, and that'll create a little bit more of a dynamic center. Less flat and solid than it was. Okay, I'm gonna let that dry, and I'll take it out to the other room and give it a photograph under natural light. The document camera here has those LED lights, so the colors aren't quite true, but hopefully you can still see the movements and hear the tips. If you end up painting your own sunflower, I'd love to see how it turns out, so be sure to take a picture and send it my way, and until next time.